Hello everyone. I'm back again. My name is Professor Andrew Timming, and I am the author of this textbook entitled Applied Statistics, Business and Management Research. Welcome back again. I'm pleased to see that you've dropped in once more to learn about applied statistics. This is the second lecture corresponding to Chapter 2 of the textbook. And in Chapter 2 of the textbook, we will be exploring the SPSS environment, getting a feel for the graphical interface that we will be using throughout the rest of this textbook to carry out a series of statistical tests. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. Let's have a look at the environment first so we can understand what it looks like and how it can be used. Now, in the previous mini lecture, Chapter 2, Lecture 1, we opened SPSS and we looked at the data view and the output window. If you haven't opened SPSS yet, please do so, because when we move forward in this lecture, we will assume that you already have the program opened. In the previous lecture, we also talked about the two data sets that we will be using in this book. These would be the data sets associated with the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, the Survey of Employees, and the Survey of Organizations. And we will actually be opening one of those data sets and doing a little work with it in this mini lecture. So again, it may be beneficial for you to pause and restart this lecture as you go through the activities that I discuss. So without further ado, let's begin. Right, so here once again you have the textbook that we're using for this lecture series. It's called Applied Statistics, Business and Management Research. You are most welcome to purchase the textbook if you'd like. I assure you as the author that it is a good textbook and it will do what it is meant to do, which is to give you a good overview of the field of applied statistics, particularly as it applies to business and management research. But of course, you're also welcome to check out the textbook at a local library so that you don't have to pay for it. Now, in the previous lecture in this series, we opened up IBM SPSS by double-clicking the icon. And we came into this landing page, which you initially just click close because it's not all that necessary. And then when you move through the landing page, you end up seeing something that looks a bit like what you see on the screen, minus the numbers in the boxes. And the reason I say minus the numbers in the boxes is that when you open up SPSS Data View, what you are opening up in the first instance is a blank document, a blank spreadsheet without any data inputted into it, without any variables, without any cases. If you were collecting your own data, at this point you could label your variables and start to input your data box by box. But because we're using secondary data in this course, you don't need to enter your data. Instead, what I'd ask you to do is to open up the file entitled chap2data.save, S-A-V. Now this, as we discussed in the previous lecture, is referred to as the survey of employees, right? So remember, this is a very large survey that essentially samples randomly up to 25 employees within the organizations that were included in the survey of organizations. Now, wherever you save this file, it could be on the companion website, you could have saved it to your desktop or elsewhere. If you want to open it, you follow the same procedures that you would follow opening almost any other document on a PC or a Mac. On a PC, you would go to File and then Open, and there are different options for opening, and the option you want to pick is Data. So File, Open, Data. then I'd like you to find where you saved this data file and double click it to open the spreadsheet that you see before you. Now, in the spreadsheet, the image that you see before you right now, I've already scrolled down a bit, so where you can see the top row is 12,000 something. And when you open the spreadsheet, it will start at row number 1. So let me just walk you through what you're looking at here. So this is the Workplace Employment Relations Survey of Employees. And in the rows in this spreadsheet, you have each individual employee who's filled out a survey. So each row corresponds to an individual employee. And in the columns, from what you see in front of you, you have the variables that were included in the survey of employees. And then in the boxes, you have the responses that an individual employee gave on an individual variable. So in the first column, SERNO, you can more or less skip that because that's simply an identifying number, right? It's not actual data. It simply identifies the individual in this particular data set, the individual employees. But then you have a series of columns starting with QA1, QA2, QA3, etc. And these columns refer to individual variables that were measured in the survey of employees. So before you move on, just pause this for a little bit and scroll around and just have a little look exploring what the survey of employees looks like in the data view in SPSS. Now at the bottom of this window, you will see two options. This is the bottom left. You can see data view and variable view. And if you click back and forth between these, you'll see that what you see on the spreadsheet changes somewhat. So in data view, which is where we were previously, each row corresponds to a participant, a case, right, a subject, and each column corresponds to a variable. Now, when you click on variable view, which is what you see before you on the slide, each row now corresponds to a variable. So in the previous version, the variables were in the columns, but in variable view, the variables are listed in the rows. And in the variable view, now the columns describe different aspects of that particular variable. So we have the name of the variable, the type, the width, the decimals, the label, values, missing values, columns, align, measure, and role. Now, not all of these columns or features of a variable are important. Some of them are more important than others, so let's spend a little bit of time looking at the more important features of the variables in variable view. Okay, so looking at the variable view columns here, bearing in mind we're still in variable view where each row now corresponds to a variable. There are some columns that are more important and other columns that are less important. So let's have a look at some of these columns here on this slide. The first column that you will see in variable view refers to the name of the variable in this particular row. So the name of the variable is a short form that describes what you're measuring. And there are a few rules for setting out names of variables. For starters, you can't have spaces in a variable name. So it has to be a series of sequential letters. And in addition, the name of the variable has to be short and concise, right? You can't have very, very long names for your variables. Now, let me give you an example. If you were to measure working hours per week, rather than putting a name as working hours per week, which would be very long and would include spaces, you could name that variable WHPW, working hours per week. So when you see WHPW, you know that that corresponds to the number of hours that a respondent has worked in a particular week. The second column is the type of variable. This typically should be listed as numeric. Numeric meaning that the variables we're using are metric. They have numbers associated with them. The width, right, the next column over, the width isn't really that important. It corresponds to the number of digits for a score or a value. So if you're using very large values, you might want to widen the width that you're using. The next column over corresponds to the number of decimal points for a score or a value. So if you have 0 decimal points, you might have a score of, let's say, 21. If you have 2 decimal points, you might have a score of 21.51. If you have 1 decimal point, it might be 21.5. So it depends on how specific you want to be in your measurement. Now, the next one over is label, and this one is very important. It's really the first one that I turn to. And this is a full question or item as it is written in the questionnaire, reproduced on the spreadsheet in variable view. So under label, you might actually write out working hours per week, or how many hours did you work in the previous week, or what is your age, or whatever the variable question is or the item is, you would reproduce that there. And the reason it's important to have labels is that if you look at working hours per week, if you look at the name as WHPW, you might not know what WHPW means, and so you go over to the label column and then you see, yes, that is working hours per week. Values is also a very important column. For values, you have to list an exhaustive list of responses as well as missing values, right? So if working hours per week is a true scale level variable, then you would have all your potential hours that you could work in a week from 0 up to, maybe 100 and some. And if you have a missing value, right, if someone doesn't respond to a particular question, you could list that as, for example, -9, so it wouldn't be confused with a real value. And then you would then in the next column over, as you can see at the second to last line on this slide, you would label that as missing, right? So this is the column where you instruct SPSS to treat a specific value as missing, right? In the previous example, as I gave, if -9 corresponds to a missing value, you need to tell SPSS that when it sees a -9 that it needs to recognize that as missing, because if you don't tell SPSS to recognize that as missing, then it will incorporate that -9 mathematically into your statistics. And then the last one is measures. This is where you define a variable as nominal, ordinal, or scale, as we discussed in previous lectures and in the previous chapter. Now in the variable view, you can click into values. And when you click into value labels, you can see the box, the window that's on your screen at the moment. So here's where you can input a value and then you can label that value. So in the example you have in front of your screen, we're dealing with a variable that is clearly a Likert scale variable, and it has been coded on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 corresponds to strongly disagree, 2 corresponds to disagree, a response of 3 corresponds to I neither agree nor disagree, a score of 4 corresponds to I agree, and a score of 5 corresponds to I strongly agree. Now, I'm not sure what exact question this is, but we know that it's a Likert scale that has responded to the question. You'll also notice at the top there I have -9 as missing. So I've inputted -9 under values, and then under label I've described it as missing. Now remember what I said in the previous slide, you need to go into the next column over, which is missing, to tell SPSS that when it sees a score of -9, that it recognizes that score as a missing value and not as a legitimate response. Because if you don't tell SPSS that -9 equals missing, then SPSS will include that number in any statistical analyses. So this is the space where you can add, change, or remove variable labels, including missing values, which in this case are labeled -9. Now, if you were using a scale variable, such as working hours per week, as we discussed in the previous slide, you might not need the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In fact, you won't, because with a scale variable, the numbers are intuitive and self-explanatory in and of themselves, right? If someone puts a 5, you don't have to say 5 equals 5 hours of work per week, because you know that that 5 already equals 5 hours of work per week, right? You will still need to, in the event of scale variables, to include a value and a label as -9 and missing, respectively, so that you can remind yourself which respondents have missing data and which don't have missing data. Now you know the difference between variable view and data view. Remember that when you're in data view, your rows correspond to cases or subjects in your sample, and your columns correspond to variables. But when you toggle to variable view, then your rows now correspond to variables, and your columns correspond to various features of those variables. And you can toggle back and forth just to get a feel for what that change means in terms of what you see. Now, the next thing I'd like to draw your attention to is what we call the SPSS Toolbar. And you can see the toolbar along the top of this screen. So we have File, Edit, View, Data, Transform, Analyze, Graphs, Utilities, Extensions, Window, and Help. These are the options at the very top of your screen. And then below we have a series of shortcuts that you can read about in the textbook, but I don't feel like we have sufficient time to go through in this lecture. So you will already be familiar with File, right? This is where you would go to open data and output files. Under Edit, you can cut, copy, and paste. You can find a particular case or even a particular variable. Under Data, you can select cases, you can split your data set, you can include and exclude cases according to the criteria that you set out. You can recode your variables and compute ones in transform. And if you don't understand what that means, don't worry, because in the next mini lecture series, we will actually go through some examples of recoding variables and computing ones in the transform function. You can use analyze to carry out the following data functions. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but a list of the functions that we will look at in this textbook and throughout this course. So this includes to generate descriptive statistics for each of your variables, to compare means, to correlate variables and run regression analyses, both linear and logistic regression analyses. You can do factor analyses under analyze, as well as non-parametric tests. You can assess reliability in the form of what we call Cronbach's alpha. All of these functions can be found under the Analyze tab. And really, this is where the real action happens in SPSS. When you're doing your analyses, you will typically start in the Analyze tab and then work your way through the different options at your disposal. We also have graphs here. You can create visual representations of your data in graphs, and we'll learn how to do that a little bit later. And lastly, I would just say that when you're feeling a bit overwhelmed and perhaps lost in terms of the number of options you have at your disposal, you can use that handy help function in the SPSS toolbar to find your way again. So before we move on, again, I would urge you just to pause and explore some of these options at this point, and then you can move on to the next slide. All right, thank you very much for taking the time to drop in and listen to this mini lecture in which we learned a bit about the SPSS environment and we explored a bit of its functionalities, looking at the difference between data view and variable view, for example, and looking at how to input values and labels, and also exploring the toolbar at the top of SPSS where most of the action happens and the commands are given to SPSS. So thanks very much. Again, I would urge you to pause here and explore a little bit before you move on to the next mini lecture, which will be Chapter 2, Lecture 3. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.